I think we're all kind of self-conscious about that.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Anne Marie and I'm from the Glenwood-Linwood Public Library. And today I have two guests that we'll be talking about funeral pre-planning with, and that is Ruth Litherland and Mike Malloy from the Burns-Kish Funeral Home located in Munster, Indiana. Today we're going to be talking about a timely topic. I feel like through a lot of our senior programming, people have asked questions about end-of-life services, funeral pre-planning, and it's becoming more and more important. And if you have the opportunity to begin thinking about it while it's still affordable for you, and if you are very specific about what you want for your funeral services, this might be an option where the information will be really important to you. So I'm going to jump right into the discussion. I looked up something that said 70% of people over 40 would prefer to plan their own funeral services, but only 17% of those people actually plan them. What do you guys say about that?
I concur with that assessment, and I think because I would fit in that demographic, as you mentioned, and I think it's you at that age you're seeing a few things, right? Maybe people close to you, grandparents, parents, maybe passing, perhaps childhood friends, coworkers that may be, and you just naturally begin to think about where you are at this point in your life and kind of what your wishes would be. Now, that would also be on top of educating your children and making your mortgage payment and things like that. So there's a lot of other demands placed on your means, if you will. But as you kind of get older, you see kind of the critical nature of the value of advanced funeral planning and funding. I think at a certain point in your life, you realize where you may have been in touch either through family members or friends where there was a sudden loss of someone in the family and there was just nothing in place. And when something such as, a natural death occurs, there's a lot of stresses and decisions made on the family in a very compressed period of time. With advanced funeral planning, you have really addressed 90% of those decisions, and they're the most critical decisions. There's always going to be decisions that need to be made, but I think it can be very low impact to the family so that the natural grieving process can occur.
And I would agree with that. There are a lot of families who they see the value of pre-planning, but it's one of those things that's so easy to put off because of everyday demands like Mike was talking about. So it's one of those things that it's like people almost dread it or are perhaps almost superstitious about it. But what I've found over and over, and I'm sure it's been similar for you too, Mike, is the fact that families often, once they do it, if they can get over that superstition or that, oh, I don't want to do this, then they actually have peace. Like, oh, okay, like there's a burden lifted off of me. My family, something happens, my family's taken care of. So.
Right, and I just was going to say that so many people don't want to talk about death, especially their own. Are there ways to make it easier for families to begin that discussion? Because like you said, so many people put it off just because everyday life gets in the way. But it's really something that is important and sort of a lost art. I mentioned when we were talking off camera that back in the day, it seems like my grandparents and family members had pre-planned for everything so that at the time of their death, everything pretty much was taken care of. The family just had to go to the funeral home, let them know that that relative had passed away, and basically everything was taken care of. They didn't have to do much of anything. And it seems like now people seek out funeral services right when the person is deceased, and they're not coming in beforehand. I think a lot of people, there's that misconception that it's expensive it's still going to be expensive whether you're doing it beforehand or right at the time of death. And like you said, superstition plays into it, that some people think that if they do consider it and start the process to pay for it, almost like they're, you know, putting a hex on themselves, that they're going to need it sooner than they anticipate. When you want to, what are the long-term benefits of pre-planning, aside from that you get to decide for yourself how you want your end-of-life services to be?
That's a very good question. And in terms of the value, and I think there's, you know, I think this is a great opportunity to really help educate and inform those watching this video. Is there's a couple of things, and I just like to kind of roll it into consumer protection, because you are talking about some very personalized wishes that you would like, but there's also going to be a you know, typically you need to fund these, so there's going to be a monetary issue involved. So I think from a consumer protection standpoint, if you were to speak with someone such as me or with Ruth, a couple things to know. Ruth and I are both licensed by the states of Illinois and Indiana, where we can work on behalf of funeral homes to write these types of contracts, if you will, that would kind of put the person with a service provider, funeral home. Number two, we operate in a very regulated industry. I think when people hear about funeral homes or cemeteries as a topical news story, it's not going to be very good. So the state has really kind of stepped in, specifically in the pre-need arena, so that the money and the funds are available at the time of need for the wishes that that person has expressed to the funeral home. Okay, so there is that. We go through an exercise twice a year where we're reporting into the state on the pre-need funeral home policies that we write and what that monetary value is. Okay, so I think that that's critical. Licensing and operating within state protocols. Number two, when you look at these pre-need policies, and it kind of touches on kind of the age with which someone may be considering this, is you know, these policies are you know, you are the owner, you are the insured, and in typical parlance, think of it much as you would a 401k. You have the portability of taking that policy with you. So if you were not, you know, say you were 50 years old and you wrote up a policy specifying what your wishes are and what that cost is, and then 30 years down the road, you're in Tucson, Arizona, living, that policy goes with you, okay, and what that policy has grown to over time. Mm-hmm. So the fact that you may not be buried by the service provider listed on the policy, that policy is still yours to be utilized, say if you were living elsewhere, or if there was a circumstances where you know, you were just to make another change in terms of who would handle your wishes. So I think that that's critical as well. And then the third thing here at Burns-Kish, you know, we work with a guaranteed contract. So there is that value of kind of locking in to costs that the funeral home can control at today's price, as opposed to what that may be at a point in the future. And that's very valuable to the consumer as well.
Can you describe the types of, maybe my question is this, when people are considering pre-planning, You know, a lot of times they're considering what type of service they want, what type of flowers, casket, if they're having one, or cremation. Are there things that the policy does not cover, or what types of services and items does it cover? And are there items that it does not?
Good question. And I think when you have this discussion, see, Ruth and I have this discussion that we're having, Anne Marie, about 24 times a week. So we have the conversation of a lifetime every day. But I think when you look at how we break down our conversations with the family, we're talking about two parts, right?
Mhm.
There's going to be the services that the funeral home can control: professional services, casketing, other merchandise, visitation, transportation, meaning hearse, and a means with which to bring the deceased to the funeral home for the preparation of the body, things of that nature. And then there's another kind of section, let's just call it part two, which we call cash advance or non-guaranteed items. And this is kind of where floral arrangements would come into play, where you're allocating a dollar amount to these
Okay.
services: death certificate, obituary. Think about, you know, in a lot of instances, there is some kind of post-service family gathering where a meal, you know, you could allocate
Mhm.
meal, or, you know, an expense amount on an allocation. Now, these, on the Part B conversation, these are just today's estimates, but you do have that ability to allocate dollars into it. We would not be able to allocate dollars for perhaps family coming in from out of town. Everything's really got to be funeral and funeral service related. And on top of that, you know, you need to consider there are some things that another area that we can't allocate funds to would be cemetery space. You know, that is a separate transaction that would need to be handled through the cemetery. Okay, so you just think of what you can allocate is going to be services and merchandise that the funeral home can control as part of their normal operation. And then two are items that we can provide a best estimate for and move from that. And another area that I didn't want to forget, obviously, is you know, clergy honorariums, church services sometimes. And Ruth and I go through a fairly detailed list, if you will. Technically, it's called a statement of goods and services, but we're going through every line item. It can be ruled out, or you can allocate a certain dollar amount. And Ruth and I would have, you know, kind of the estimates in terms of what we see based on what those costs could be. Because the ultimate goal in this is really to kind of get to a number, if you will, where all the wishes of the consumer is met, how it would be carried out at the time of need. Again, we're in a space where we're talking about something that will occur in the future, correct? We are not paid, or there's no funds that are being exchanged with the funeral home for services that have not been provided.
Okay.
In advanced funeral planning and funding, there's a third party who Ruth and I are affiliated with that will hold that money until the time of need, in which it's dispersed to the funeral home to carry through or carry out everything that that person has wished for.
So then is it very similar to like a trust or insurance policy, in a sense, that how you're saying a third party is holding on to the money until those funds need to be used?
Correct. With the funeral homes, Ruth and I are affiliated with a company called Security National Life. We've been in the pre-need space since 1965, and we are right throughout the United States. So we have a national presence in what we do, and we kind of partner with funeral homes, and we partner with family-owned funeral homes. Anne Marie, specifically, just because we feel that they're the best aligned and will provide the continuity of services to the families within the communities they serve. So that's really, you know, when this really comes together, the funeral home is the service provider. We are using their pricing information based on the wishes of the consumer. And we're tying that in together through Security National Life. So the insured, the owner, the service provider, to Security National Life to be dispersed at the time of need.
So if you do funeral pre-planning and you choose the different types of services that you want for this policy, that I want to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly, is that it's locking in today's price with that funeral home for whatever service that is, not including the items that we talked about that are separate, like, you know, florists can charge more or less. Some of the other things, you know, memorial luncheons and stuff, you're saying you still can allocate some funds towards that, but those are items that can fluctuate. When you're making a policy, you're locking in at whatever the rate is now. So even if, like how you gave the example of somebody at 50 years old, and then, you know, 30 years later needing to use that policy, they would be locked in 2020's rates for those services with that funeral home, as opposed to, let's say it's gone up significantly since then, of course, you still would be getting the rate that from when you first started your policy.
Yeah, and I think the easiest way to think of it, Anne-Marie, is Part A and Part B. Part A in our discussion is always going to be based on what the funeral home can control. Part B is always going to be what we call these cash advance items or best estimates on these, you know, list of items that are typically part of a funeral service. Okay,
Sure.
so you're correct. So I just like to, it's kind of easier, you know, Part A and Part B. So let's say you've got a $10,000 funeral, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Part A is $8,000. Part B is $2,000 as it totals up.
Mm-hmm.
Part A, the $8,000 is going to be guaranteed.
Right.
The $2,000, maybe a little bit more, but these policies grow over time. So depending on what that actual cost is at the $2,000 rate, you know, the family may have some cost exposure to that. But then again, it's important to note that that policy is going to be funded several years, and perhaps there'll be enough in that fund to cover everything as warranted and as written. So it's just going to be one of those, I think, an area to talk through so that there's a full understanding of where there may be some cost exposure to the family moving forward.
Majority of the items would be locked in though, all the funeral home services. So that it, as you mentioned, as Mike mentioned, that's one of the major reasons that families pre-plan, especially if they end up living 20, 30 years. They save, you know, they say statistically funeral home pricing across the nation doubles every 10 to 12 years. So if you pre-plan in advance, the more in advance you pre-plan, the more it can actually benefit you because you'll save so much money potentially by doing that.
How safe are your funeral funds once you put them into this policy?
They're very safe, and I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier. We work in a regulated industry. Our industry, funeral homes are audited by the state. From a funding perspective with, I'll use Security National Life. Security National Life, and again, pre-need companies or insurance companies that are in this space, these are not going to be the MetLifes or the Liberty Mutuals or the Prudentials. These are not branded life insurance companies like you may see. So Security National Life, we are we're based in founded in 1965. We are based in Salt Lake City, Utah. We have a sales office that Ruth and I kind of report into in New Orleans. We are a publicly traded corporation on the NASDAQ. Okay. Number two, we also became part of the Russell Index, the Russell 2000, a little bit earlier in the year. So I think from a transparency standpoint for families knowing how these funds are protected so that they're available at the time of need, it's critical to know the performance of the carrier who is holding these funds. And then just as a matter of course, with reinsurance, we are a member of kind of both the Illinois and Indiana, not to get into the weeds too much, but reinsurance. So if there was a hiccup with Security National Life, some point down the road, we have the insurance guarantee associations behind us that would still make the families whole or the funeral homes whole at the time of need. So there is that layer of protection. So just to kind of break it down, think about regulated industry. There are things that we have to be able to show and perform, state legislatures throughout the country. Number two, our financials are strong enough and we operate responsibly and accountably in the markets that we serve so that you can kind of track us from a NASDAQ listing standpoint or from a Russell 2000 and kind of see how we're making sure that the dollars for the families that have put their trust in us are available at the time of need.
Tell me this, when you decide you're considering pre-planning, is there something specific that you should look for in a funeral home when you're going to decide? I mean, there's a lot of different funeral homes. Let's say that you are familiar with a few different ones, but you want to go and do the pre-planning.
Yeah.
Are there specific questions or are there things to consider, or things you should look for when you're contacting the funeral home? Most people, their family uses a specific one. Maybe everybody has been laid at one. You know, let's say beside trying to look for cost-wise, the best cost or cost for the funeral home offering all the options that you would like, is there anything else that people should consider when they're thinking about going to talk to a person, or maybe they're going to a few different places to kind of compare? Is there something they should look for?
Absolutely. The first thing on the list in capital letters is that consumers want to go to family-owned, multi-generational funeral homes in their area. There are corporate-owned funeral homes where the primary goal is shareholder value. Family-owned funeral homes are dedicated to the communities and the people that are within those communities. That is a huge difference, a huge difference. You know, I think some of the other things to kind of keep on your radar screen is you can always walk into a funeral home. Funeral directors love their funeral homes. It's their baby. They want to show it off to people. So they would love to show you kind of the viewing areas, the chapel areas and things like that, and talk a little bit about the history of the funeral home, because as you can surmise, multi-generational, it's going back close to 100 years in a lot of instances. So there's a lot of pride with how they work in the communities that they serve. So that is in my view, that is the most critical piece of information to know. Corporate-owned funeral homes, the drive is to increase shareholder value. Family-owned funeral homes, it's to serve those that are under their care.
Okay. If you're going to consider pre-planning and you're considering a funeral insurance, what about if you have pre-existing conditions? Are there any kind of health limits on it? You know, do they do any kind of medical questionnaire? Does that influence what you pay?
There are a series of medical questions. The medical questions are not intrusive. It allows us to kind of put that person in the right category from a risk management perspective. You will not be ruled out with any pre-existing condition or anything of that nature. You are not required to submit us a blood test or go get a physical in any way. But there are medical questions that we need to ask, and we'll note that on the application, but it will not rule out anyone from being offered protection in the advanced funeral planning space. It's just more of a product category, and that falls kind of into the, let's just say, the actuarial science of insurance, and how best we can protect.
So on that note, does funeral insurance work like life insurance, where let's say I came in today and I signed up to do some funeral pre-planning, took out an insurance for that. Is there a certain amount of time I have to hold that policy before there will be a payout? Or is there a certain amount of time, maybe my question is there a certain amount of time I have to pay on it before those benefits would be paid? So let's say if I took it this month and 3 months down the line, my family needed it because something happened to me. Is there some sort of amount of time that has to go by, or is it like immediate? Like, what if I left and something happened to me on my way home after I came? Would it be, you know, and I made the first payment, would it pay me out already?
Yeah, this would go back to kind of the product categorization that would be based on the health conditions.
Okay.
So number one, if you, and let's just use this $10,000 funeral that I threw out earlier for simplicity. Let's say you came in, you sat with Ruth, and that totaled $10,000, and you stroked a check to Security National Life for $10,000. You're immediately protected. Okay.
So if I only paid $100, I'd only be $100
No,
protected.
no. What I'm saying, if you paid it in full,
Okay.
you are covered.
Okay.
Okay. And let's say, you know, you wish to pay over time.
Correct.
Okay. At our age, you would have at the most 10 years to pay
Okay.
those premiums amount based on the funeral price. So what would occur, let's say you're making payments for a year over a 10-year, 8-year, 5-year, 3-year period of time.
Okay.
And you pass within 8 months.
Mm-hmm.
What you'll see in these policies is that you will the amounts dispersed to the funeral home will be those first 8 months of premium returned.
Okay.
And then typically it'll be about another 10%. Okay. And then that remaining value, the exposure would be to the family.
Okay.
And the reason being is, you know, again, when we kind of look at something over time, it's really kind of putting the, you know, from exposure risk management, however you want to kind of categorize this, but it just allows us to kind of manage our book of business better, where we are returning dollars. It may not be in full, but it's how managing that allows us to be in the Russell 2000, right? It just allows us to be a strong company. Now, yeah, and because there's more, this is a critical kind of area in which it's critical. So if we could just spend a few more minutes on
sure.
it.
Yeah.
I think it's valuable. Now, let's say, again, $10,000 funeral, you're taking 10 years to pay,
Mm-hmm.
and say after 2 years you pass. So you paid 2 years of premium in against the $10,000 funeral. We would then disperse the full $10,000 or whatever that's grown to the funeral home. So you're fully covered, right? I think there's an important distinction on people who may be viewing this like as, okay, if I'm on a payment plan and I don't make it through the first year, I just get my premiums back,
Mm-hmm.
a little clip above it. Then again, if I'm taking 10 years and I live past the first 2 years and something should occur, I'm in full, right?
Mm-hmm.
That full amount's going to be dispersed. So it's, and you know, that's something is that when people have that conversation with Ruth and I on this topic, we go through this very thoroughly, because there needs to be an understanding, because I think what we don't want to occur is something happening in the pre-need space. Family comes in and said, geez, Dad told me his funeral arrangements were all taken care of.
Right.
And it may not be the case. So again, you know, Ruth and I, at the end of the day, in these discussions, we're lenders of good advice. We are licensed to sell a product specific to this area, advanced funeral planning and funding. But in a lot of times our discussion is really one of information and education, so that, you know, we're doing this at a time when people are healthy. We can go through options. What would happen if, you know, things like that. So it's really more to kind of allow the families to be better educated and know what options and how these things work.
Sure.
After something were to occur.
Sure. I just wanted to kind of dispel the misconception that some people might have that, you know, that if they came and they paid, you know, they purchased a plan, and then they, you know, they believe, like you said, how sometimes families will come and say, oh, you know, so and so, my family member said that they already had it paid for. I think it's important for those people to share it with their family that, you know, after so long, then this is what the amount would be that would be dispensed for it. Because some people might be under the misconception that because I purchased it, if I were to pass in 2 months, they don't realize they're just going to get the 2 months that they paid in plus that little bit more, as opposed to the whole amount. And so that's what I want. And it is similar to life insurance. Like some of them have where to be fully vested, you know, you have to have held it for 2 years before they'll pay you the entire amount you took it out for, as opposed to just like what you said, just what you've put into it plus maybe an additional, you know, small percentage. So that was the reason for that question.
Yeah, but go ahead.
I was just going to say, if I could say something, just to emphasize what Mike was saying, that would apply if you have a pre-existing condition. If you answer the health questions favorably, you have coverage from day one. Or if you had an accidental death, you would have coverage from day one. You don't have that 2-year wait. It's for those, maybe if you have a heart condition and you take heart medication or something like that, that you would have that 2-year wait where it would pay out in full. And then after that, once you get past that 2-year mark, then it will pay out in full plus interest. So it's kind of a no-lose situation. It's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. And to me, that also reinforces the importance of people considering, when you were talking about a possible 10-year amount of time that you're paying, to me, it reinforces the importance of considering it while you're working. I think it becomes incredibly more difficult for people on fixed income after retirement to start considering paying into that, especially if they want to pay for that long of a period of time and they're not in a financial position to pay upfront. That this is something that people should consider when they are in a better financial, just their finances are better because they're working, because then if they do need that long of a period of time and they know that more than likely they're going to be working throughout that time, it's more easy for them to pay that as opposed to somebody who's retired and now start to think about that, and so that was another really relevant point to me that when you were talking about that makes, and I hope that people consider that. Can you tell me if there is a difference between funeral insurance and burial insurance? Or are they the same thing and people just call them two different things?
When I think of burial insurance, I think of the transaction that's been made at the cemetery.
Okay.
Right?
That's kind of what I was thinking, but I wanted to make sure because I think some people might be under the misconception that funeral pre-planning means also including wherever they'd like their remains to be, whether they're going to be cremated and put in a little mausoleum, or if they're going to have an actual plot. So that would be something that they would seek information on from an actual cemetery.
I think when you're looking at kind of the funeral space in general, including burial, again, kind of two components. There's the funeral home, there's the cemetery. They're not the same, separate and distinct. So in a lot of instances, there's going to be two financial transactions that will need to be addressed.
I think sometimes those terms are used interchangeably, so it's a little confusing.
But I think you're right. I think that a lot of times people think that because when they go to the funeral home for a loved one, the funeral home contacts the cemetery. So I think that they believe that it's all inclusive, in that. And so sometimes I'm just thinking ahead that there might be people who do the funeral pre-planning and believe that the part of course, you guys would tell them that's separate. You need to talk to the funeral home, the cemetery or whatever place you'd like to be interred. But I think that most people just automatically, it's just all funeral in their mind. And so that's why I just wanted to make sure that there was a distinction between they knew.
And then as another caveat, there are funeral homes and cemeteries on the same property, and it's kind of, so it's.
But they still would be separate policies, correct? Even if it's in that case, the funeral home is.
I think if the funeral home is attached to the cemetery, it would be one transaction because typically the ownership is going to be one entity.
And sometimes families too, they just want one payment plan. So sometimes we will set aside some funds for the opening and closing and marker, which are technically cemetery items on the pre-arrangement. But just to be clear, they are two totally different things. And we obviously can't guarantee a cemetery's price, but we can certainly set money aside for it, just like we would flowers or something like that. And if families are lost about a cemetery, we can often make recommendations and say, well, these are the funeral homes that are beautiful. These are the funeral homes that are reasonably priced. We can give them direction if they want. And in many cases, families already have a family plot that they've used for years. They obviously would need to go to the cemetery to pick out the plots. So.
Let me ask you this. Once you have a policy, when it's time for your family to use it, can a family member change any component of it if maybe something that you wanted is no longer available? What I mean is, like, I know you were saying that it was portable, that your policy, so if you moved somewhere and then needed it. But let's say that the specific funeral home that your family's used for years goes out of business. Does that automatically default that the family can change that because it's no longer available? Or let's say you had somebody come in and they want a specific casket in a specific color, and they just don't make that anymore. I know that you probably would offer them something that would be as close to what they've wanted. But let's say the family member comes in, or the family comes in and wants to change something just because it's not available, or it's you know, something that maybe that was their dying wish, that they said, oh, I put this in there, but I really don't want that anymore. Can they change that in a policy?
Sure, yes, you can make changes. Sometimes people down the road say, you know, we've thought about it and we want to add a service. At first we just wanted cremation, but now we want to add in a service as well. You can do that. That's not a problem. There are some people, in most cases, families want their kids to have some flexibility to make changes when the time comes. And like you mentioned, some might be absolutely necessary if a funeral home were to go under, which this particular funeral home, Burns-Kish, is in great shape. That's not going to happen. But as we know, it happens all the time that funeral homes, you know, go out of business, or they just decide to end the business. You have all kinds of flexibility where obviously if you need to make a change, if the casket is no longer available, we can pick out something similar. In rare cases, we have families where they're concerned that their families are going to make changes that they don't want. And there actually are documents that you can sign to help protect that from happening if you're worried that someone's going to make changes that you don't want, that are against your wishes, to help protect yourself. But in most cases, families want their loved ones to have that flexibility. So.
Okay. When you're considering funeral pre-planning, one of the things I was reading online was they were saying that you should always ask for an itemized cost list, especially if you're going to different places to compare pricing, unless you're just somebody that you already know what funeral home you want to use and you kind of already know you're not interested in looking anywhere else. When you do the funeral pre-planning, do you have the ability to look for some of those items, let's say like the casket, from somewhere else and not include that? So is that, or do you have to, when you're choosing, I know you said you go through a list, and you're not obligated to choose everything on the list, of course, but does it give any leeway if there were things that are maybe part of the funeral service that or that the funeral provides that you'd like to change, or you know, I'm even thinking, and I've heard this one time when I went to a funeral, was that somebody passed away and their relative recently became an embalmer and wanted that person to come to embalm them, even though they wanted to use a specific funeral home. How does that work?
For the embalming, if those were the wishes, we could reach out and bring in an embalmer to handle that, right? That's not an issue. That's more of a logistical and coordinating matter that doesn't detract from the policy. I think if what you were hitting on earlier would be if I went to Costco and picked out a casket.
Absolutely.
I thought the first question to the consumer would be, what are you going to do with it? You going to keep it in the garage?
Yeah.
All right. We're not going to store it.
Right.
Number one. Number two, how are you going to get the casket to the funeral home? We're not coming to get it.
Right. No, I get what you're saying.
That's what I would
hear so many people say that, you know, it's really something to touch on, is that, you know, people that are always looking for a deal, even in death, will recommend to somebody, hey, Costco sells them this much less, you know, and you're right.
You know,
unless you're going to set it up in a bedroom somewhere, I mean,
you know, if you've got a generous relative who has not preceded you in death and they can put the casket in the F-150, you know, we'll be more than happy to do that. And I think, you know, but all seriousness aside, I think the question that you run into, or what would want to be vetted out a little bit more, is, you know, say if I were to buy a casket from Costco, and I want to be buried at XYZ cemetery. Will XYZ cemetery allow for that construction, and perhaps if it's a gasketed or sealed casket or not? It's just making sure that it would, right? Because cemeteries operate under restrictions as well. So not out of line to ask that, but you just want to dig deeper. And again, that's where, you know, Ruth and myself can become a lender of good advice in this space, because you think that, but there's always, it always has repercussions, you know, down the line. And so you just want to be able to bring those to the forefront. Again, you don't want to make these decisions when something has happened, because these decisions are going to be very compressed, and there can be a lot of unnecessary cost associated with decisions made under duress than if you had the hour and a half to kind of talk through everything that occurs would be beneficial.
Another thing I wanted to ask was, when you're considering pre-planning, why is there a need to pre-plan if you have life insurance? A lot of people you hear will say, well, I have life insurance to cover it. Why is pre-planning still an important option, even if you have a life insurance policy?
Yeah, I look at pre-planning, right? Let's just take, this is your financial picture. It's made up of various components of savings and insurance and other assets. Advanced funeral planning has one purpose and one purpose only. It's to cover the cost of the expenses in your passing and in your, you know, right, assuming you've made the burial choices. Life insurance, and especially if you are, if young children are dependent upon you and a spouse that's dependent upon you, is to really allow them to remain in the lifestyle with which you have afforded them. Making the house payments, saving for education, other things where life insurance really comes, you know, into play. So again, separate and distinct. I think it's critical that a good estate plan or financial plan has both.
Mhm.
You know, life insurance, I just think it's critical. The arena that Ruth and I are in is, yes, technically it's the life insurance kind of arena, but it's more of a modified life insurance contract, and we've got one purpose and one purpose only.
I always tell families life insurance is for the living, it's for those who are left behind, you know, to take care of, pay bills, medical bills, expenses, you know, like Mike referenced, maintaining your lifestyle. And we're a big proponent of life insurance, but the only downside to regular life insurance is that it's not inflation adjusted. If you pre-plan and pre-fund your funeral, it is inflation adjusted. It has that protection built in where the vast majority of the items are locked in at that price. They're guaranteed, and you don't have to worry about the future price increases. Even if that casket quadruples between now and the time that you pass, it's locked in at that price. And you don't get that from a regular life insurance policy. Someone might have got, you know, a $50,000 life insurance policy, or maybe a $10,000 life insurance policy in 1945, which was a lot of money then. $10,000 in many cases, depending on what kind of a funeral and what kind of casket you pick out, may not even cover all of the funeral expenses today. And the idea is to leave some money behind for those who are left behind, to take care of them, where this is simply to fund your funeral. It's for a totally different purpose than for what life insurance was meant. So.
Yeah, and to pick up on that, and not to belabor the point, but again, you know, kind of the difference between what Ruth and I work in pre-need versus what you hear typically is, say, final expense. Same kind of idea. Final expense is a bucket of money. You aren't indicating a service provider. You're not allocating funds for specific services that the funeral home can provide. You don't know what their costs are. Here, we're taking the price list of the funeral home and we're allocating, and I want to say allocating funds to a very specific line item for that particular service or merchandise, you know, if you will. So very separate, distinct. The value of pre-need is that you have a very itemized, documented piece of information that's kept on file at the funeral home for what your wishes are and what the costs are to that. And it's guaranteed, and you know, the agents responsible for putting it together are licensed within the state, and the funeral homes reporting that information to the state as well. A lot of consumer protection and a lot of, I think, accountability, if you will. Correct.
Yeah, I really like how you said that it, when you're saying that the life insurance is for the living, because you hear so many people that like through their employer or even on their own will take out a life insurance policy, and you'll hear them say, so if I die, there's money for you to bury me. And like you said, you know, if you're taking a specific amount and, you know, you don't pass on until 25 years later, the cost that you're locking yourself in with doing a funeral pre-plan is going to save you in the long run, because the costs are always going to get a little bit higher. I'm sure with different, and it was going to be one of my questions for you was if you could share some of the trends that you see with funeral planning. I mean, most people are either for a wake, they don't want a wake. You know, sometimes they want a clergy, they don't, whether they want to be cremated or they want it to be buried. But I'm just wondering if there's any trends that you see when you're doing funeral pre-planning that maybe are things that people don't consider that are popular now, or that have changed over the years as you've done policies, that people are considering that maybe they didn't before, or now they're not considering anymore.
Right. Well, I mean, I think cremation is definitely on the rise. In my experience, the number one reason families actually choose cremation is because there wasn't necessarily a lot of planning done ahead of time and there were no funds set aside. So many families choose cremation because they feel like they have no other option. Now it is becoming more common, and so I think it's becoming more widely accepted. So a nice compromise if families are trying to work with a budget is to have a simple traditional funeral service with cremation following, so their family still gets to say goodbye the way they remember them. I, several years ago, actually met with a lady. She was in tears. Her husband was a traveling salesman. He just unexpectedly passed away as a fairly young man in California, and she did not have the funds to have him brought here. So she had to have him cremated there and brought here. And, you know, she kissed him goodbye, and literally he came back in a box. And she just broke down in tears and said, you know, I felt like I never got to say goodbye. And so that's why she pre-planned her funeral. She preferred the traditional funeral service. And we certainly have cremation for families who wish that. But it's my whole thought, again, the whole point of pre-planning is to remove that burden from your loved one. And yes, to lock in the pricing, but it just makes it so much easier. But yes, cremation is on the rise. And I personally think that's kind of how it started for families who just didn't, you know, get a chance, didn't take the time to plan ahead of time.
So is there a significant difference in pricing? Because before it seemed like people chose cremation, like you said, because it was a more affordable option. But when you're talking about having like a viewing with the cremation, it still is a significant cost because they have to prepare the body, they have to, you know, wake it and stuff. So is that sort of a myth that cremation is less expensive? If all you're doing is just cremation, I could see it being less expensive, but when you're still adding on those additional services, Does it still sometimes come close to what a regular funeral, where you're being waked and then having a service and then, you know, being buried? Is it similar in price?
It certainly can be, especially if the family selects a more expensive urn. Generally speaking, even with the funeral service added, it still is less, it's enough of a difference to make people sometimes still choose it, because it just still generally is less expensive, especially when you consider that the cemetery cost won't be there if you're not going to bury the cremains. And even if you do, your costs are generally cut in half as far as the opening and closing to dig the space. So it still usually comes out to quite a bit less, again, depending on the circumstances, what kind of urn you pick out and so forth. So it's still a cost savings in most cases, even if you have the traditional funeral service first with cremation following. And as you mentioned, yes, there's a big difference. If you just have a direct cremation with no service, then of course that's far less than it would be if you had any kind of a service. So.
Another question I had, and I just thought of it while we were talking, was does each individual funeral home, is there a difference in the amount that they charge for services? Do they each choose their own amount for services? Because that's something that people probably want to consider. I mean, I know they talk about shopping around and getting an itemized list, but so you can see where some might be more as opposed to another one, even though it's the same type of service. So that would be important to consider.
Yeah, so each, you know, and again, we're talking about family-owned funeral home. And so it is going to vary by funeral home. And, you know, that's why I think it's important for the consumer to have a conversation, because the funeral home, a lot of that pricing is going to be based on how they take care of your loved one.
Sure.
There's value in that, and they will price accordingly. And it's the resources that they're able to provide post funeral and burial, you know, just kind of what they have at their disposal to share, should it come to some sort of grief counseling, or how do I, you know, unlock some Social Security dollars for this, or if there may have been any unclaimed veterans benefit. I mean, there, you know, I think the funeral homes and funeral directors are there to serve, and they that information is at their disposal, and the consumer needs to be able to tap into those resources that are available to them. That's what brings value to funeral homes as well, and that may be reflected in kind of some of that variation, you know, in price. So it's going to be, you know, funeral homes operate on the sense of human dignity, and they're tremendous resources in this arena to be, I think, utilized as most effectively as possible.
Can you tell me, and unless there's anything else that you'd like to share afterwards, I'll make it sort of that I can wrap up with the question that if someone is considering pre-planning, funeral pre-planning, what type of homework do they need to do before they come see you? Is there anything that they should consider beforehand to get the most benefit from their meeting with you and be ready for the questions or some of the considerations they'll have to make?
Yeah, I typically like to, you know, and again, sometimes it's in order for me to prepare, but I like to know if they're considering one, cremation or burial. You know, there's a lot of flexibility in cremation, and Ruth mentioned it, is that you can have much the same thing as you would a traditional burial, and cremation is the end result. Two, I like to inquire as to whether or not cemetery has been purchased, because there's 4 components that make up cemetery cost. And I like to have a sense of what they have, and then to bring a copy of that paperwork with them. And then number 3, again, which I think are the most critical, is if there's anyone in the house, spouse or a deceased spouse, that may have been military. And it would be just a matter of bringing in the DD-214. If an adult child is looking into this on behalf of an elderly parent, I always request that they bring in some kind of power of attorney that reflects they're able to make these decisions on behalf of the elderly parent. And it would be power of attorney specific to financial and property, not necessarily the healthcare portion of that. And that's usually, you know, it. And like I said, Ruth and I, these are conversations. We do not just say, here you go. We want to talk, and we want to be lenders of good advice as it impacts this.
So then is it sometimes common that you might meet with a family or with a specific person more than, you know, a few times as they decide what they want as they go along to make their final? Because I'm sure there's a lot of times you choose something and then you change your mind, or you went home, you thought about it, and now you didn't like that, or you want to change this and that. So I would assume that you would talk to them a number of times before they finally are comfortable with what they've chosen.
Correct. Yeah, you know, at the end of the day, Ruth and I are resources to the family.
Exactly.
And then my last question, I know I said the last one was my last question, but I was thinking about this too. With the trends, aside from cremation, do you get a lot of people that request like these eco burials? I read about them on occasion, and I always wonder, you know, you get inundated where you could be made into a piece of jewelry, you can be, you know, have a tree buried, you could be in a pod, you could be, you know, and I'm sure that there is a market for those individuals who want to be earth friendly and want to maybe sometimes think outside the box. Do you see that? Have you gotten people that have asked for that, or do you think that that's something that may trend more, or are people still pretty much traditional in the types of funerals that they're planning for themselves?
I don't, well, as soon as you brought this up, I was waiting for it, but I think I've heard the same thing, and I see that occurring out on the West Coast and in the Northeast. Trends can always change. You know, here in the good old Midwest, I don't know how impactful that trend could be. I think worth noting, I've certainly handled my fair share of kind of inquiries, or you know, what is this all about, as opposed to something that would appeal to anyone at this point. But I think, yes, you're hearing more and more about it. I think, you know, kind of with just how the ecology is more and more in the you know, mainstream press, you know, with everything that's going on, is that you're going to hear more and more of those kind of trends. It's occurring. Funeral homes are aware of it. As to whether or not it becomes an offering, remains to be seen. I just don't right, and I can only speak to the funeral homes that I work with.
I've had several inquiries as well. It's whether or not it picks up and becomes a big trend here, you know, remains to be seen. What I've recommended to families who want to be as green as possible, the traditional Jewish funeral is actually pretty green. There's, you know, generally there is a vault used that has no bottom to it. So it literally is ashes to ashes, dust to dust. If you're going to be cremated, you could use an eco-friendly. We've had many families use the eco-friendly urns that naturally disintegrate if they're not interested in preserving the cremains and they want everything go back to the, you know, to nature, ashes to ashes. That's an option as well. You could get something a container that's more biodegradable if you feel strongly that you'd like a green burial.
Are eco funerals a little bit more expensive than what a traditional one would be, just because the market in this area is not, it hasn't really taken off as much here, or just, and I'm thinking it in terms of, you know, if you shop at Whole Foods, everybody says it's more expensive than going to the regular grocery store. So I'm thinking, is it doing it more eco-friendly? Is it a little bit more expensive than what it would be for a traditional funeral, in terms of like what you're encapsulated in, or want the tree grown, or?
Yeah, you know, that's a good question. I think, you know, when you get into, is it less than or more than what you would consider a traditional funeral? It's really going to depend on what you want.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is really kind of, I hate to use the analogy, but in terms of services and related merchandise and other things, it's kind of going to the grocery store and
Mm-hmm.
be it Mariano's or Whole Foods. And it's going to be kind of what your price point is. You know, I think when you, to your question earlier, and especially when it comes to casketing, you know, on cost, on, you know, what drives funeral costs is, you know, think of yourself as a consumer. Are you, when you go into a store, are you going for that high priced item,
Right.
or is it going to be somewhere, because there's a variation
There's a
of
price
cost even.
Sure.
So it's, you know, again, it's kind of knowing that about yourself can really make these discussions more effective.
Okay. Are you at liberty to share what is maybe one of the more expensive policies that you've done for somebody? I mean, because I know that there are folks out there that have, I mean, they've made TV shows with people that have these really just exotic, extravagant requests that they want to have done. Or do you find that most of them fall, you know, within a certain range for most people? Or have you dealt with folks who really come in that almost like when they leave, you're like, oh my goodness, you know, that they just, their requests are really grandiose?
I've written some fairly large policies as they rate against the national average, and I'm talking traditional burial. But the means were there by the family. There was a, you know, a 2-day visitation as opposed to kind of what you see in 1 day.
Yeah.
There were some logistical issues involved that involved, you know, kind of moving the body from Florida, bringing them back home into Illinois. And there was a very nice mahogany casket that this gentleman utilizes. God bless him. So,
Yeah.
you know, again, it's just, but this was was well within his and his family's means, and this is what he got, or this is what he wanted. And the funeral home provided what he wanted at the time of need. So it's just kind of knowing yourself a little bit, and it helps with the discussions
Sure.
with someone like Ruth or myself.
I've had similar experiences, but most families, I would say, it would be probably the same for you, Mike. Most families are a little bit more budget conscious. Like some people want an $8,000 casket, but most people don't. Most people want something that's more middle of the road, respectful, but more reasonable. So it just all depends. Everyone's budget is different. Everyone's needs are different. So.
Is there anything else that you would like to share about pre-planning that maybe we didn't cover, that you just want to touch on really quick before we conclude our discussion?
Yes, if I could, it'd be a minute. And it would be for adult children, kind of caring for an elderly parent. And it could mean elderly parent is coming from a private pay institution or from home into a Medicaid scenario. And the value of the prepaid funeral policy is that it becomes a Medicaid exempt asset.
Yes.
Okay, so
Oh,
these
that's
spend
important to
down
know.
Medicaid, not Medicare, Medicaid, state-run, state federal programs, different in Indiana that it is in Illinois. But I think if there are those of you that may be kind of tapping into this recorded program, I can tell you I had a 7-year journey with Alzheimer's, dementia, private pay, Medicaid, with a parent of mine, and the prepaid funeral that we were advised to get is invaluable to my siblings and I to this day.
It was a protected asset for Medicaid.
Sure. And I think what is the state's payout for that? Social Security gives you like a $255 benefit, which probably doesn't cover really anything. I mean, if you want to be honest, and unless you're going to rent a backhoe and bury yourself in your yard, and I know that's sad to say, but for $255, that might be the best that you could get on what Social Security will disperse to your family.
$255 will get you kind of the minimum Chicago Tribune obit.
Yeah, so that's something to that's another reason to consider the pre-planning, is because if you find that at the end of your life, like you said, if you go from where you had a lot of assets and then you had to move to Medicaid, which normally will require you to use any monetary assets that you have if you have this plan in place and it's protected, that burden is out of the way. They can't touch that. They can't take that from you. And at least you have it at the time of death, which is, like you said, it's invaluable, especially because when you see what Social Security will give you, and you're comparing it to just being able to get the obituary in the newspaper, hopefully, yeah, that's important to know. And it's important for people to know that if their situation changed where it was like that, what they paid into that policy can't be touched. So
Yes.
that's very important.
Families will qualify. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go on, please.
I was just going to say families will qualify if they're trying to qualify for Medicaid, then they should probably see someone like us, like Mike or myself, because by doing this, they're that much closer to their goal, because that's what they'll likely be told if they're trying to qualify. You have too much quote funds, and this is one way to ensure that money will go for something that will benefit them. So, to cover your loved one's expenses.
Yeah, and that's true with burial space, Anne Marie, as well.
Okay.
It becomes a Medicaid exempt.
Oh, see, that's good to know as well. I was going to ask too about what about like cemetery stuff? Would that be? So that's good to know. At least if you've already pre-planned for that, that's protected. And with the price of aging and sort of end of life care, they can deplete. You can go through your funds really, really fast.
Like
So, faster than you would imagine. You could look
Yes.
at the number and say, oh, I'm good for a while. But the stark reality is that sometimes that little while is like a month or two, and then you totally have nothing. So that makes it even more important to consider pre-planning, in my opinion. I mean, and the earlier that you can consider it and start to look into it, of course, the better.
Yeah, you could spend another session just on the Medicaid impact with, as it relates to senior advocacy and welfare.
Sure, because I'm sure there's a lot with that. So I'm going to conclude our discussion unless there's anything else that you want to add in. If any patrons are interested in more information, please contact the Burns-Kish Funeral Home in Munster and speak with either Mike Malloy or Ruth Litherland to get more information and perhaps set up an appointment where you can come in and discuss your own personal needs with them. I hope that this has been informative for everyone, and I thank you again for joining me and joining the discussion. And thank you so much to Ruth and to Mike for being available for this. Thank you again.
Thank you,
for
Anne
having
Marie.
us.
Yeah, enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Thank you.